Sold to the Alpha King. Chapter 5. Damien pressed himself flat against the rough bark of the ancient oak, ears ringing with the thunder of his own heartbeat. The moon's pale light glimmered through the canopy, picking out the faint shapes of Tanya and her cloaked companions as they prowled around the clearing. They were so close he could see the tension in Tanya's posture, the tight angle of her shoulders as she lifted her chin, scanning the shadows with cold determination. Every nerve in Damien's body screamed at him to move, to run, but he held himself rigid. A single misstep, even the slightest rustle of leaves, would draw them right to his hiding spot. Just moments before, he had caught phrases of a conversation so treacherous that the weight of it still rattled in his chest. Tanya meant to overthrow Alpha Ezra, and she had allies from beyond the fortress walls. Damien clenched his fists at his sides, a sheen of sweat gathering at his temples despite the cool forest night. His mind raced through what he had heard. Talk of seizing power, forging an alliance with outsiders, a direct threat to Ezra's leadership. Worse still, they had spoken of Alara as a target if she became too powerful or too inconvenient. Damien's stomach twisted. He had known Tanya was manipulative, but this was far worse. A cold, calculated plan to bring the fortress to its knees. Now here he was, pinned against a tree with nowhere to go. A single observer with a secret that could save them all. Tanya lifted a hand, halting the movements of her cloaked partners. Her hazel eyes narrowed, scanning the darkness. Damien watched her pivot in his direction, the corners of her mouth twisting with frustration and suspicion. One of the cloaked figures shifted his stance, the glint of a knife catching the moonlight. Damien's lungs constricted. He was sure that in the next blink of an eye they would find him. He thought of Alara, of her quiet determination, the way she tried to keep her head down, how she was always bravely forging ahead despite her father's cruelty and Tanya's intimidation. He thought of Ezra, the Alpha who might not be perfect but who led with a certain honor that still anchored the fortress. If Damien failed now, if he were caught, both of them would be left in unimaginable peril. He felt a sudden stirring in the forest, a shuffle of branches somewhere deeper in the trees. At first he feared another conspirator approached, but the sound wasn't close. Tanya stiffened at the noise, turning her head sharply toward the disturbance. In the moonlight, Damien spotted a flicker of movement, a deer, perhaps, or a lone wolf, snapping a branch under its hoof or paw. Tanya took 2 steps in that direction, and in that tiny window of inattention, Damien seized his chance. Heart pounding, he slid behind the trunk, moving deeper into the underbrush. Every movement was a risk, but the distraction bought him time. He crouched low, forcing himself to breathe slowly, ignoring the ache in his thighs as he crept away, each stride as quiet as he could manage. Any slip could still betray him, if Tanya or one of her allies looked back too soon. A muted discussion rose behind him, Tanya barking a quiet order. Another of the conspirators muttered something about checking the perimeter. Damien's spine prickled, but he continued his careful retreat, each frantic second feeling like an hour. At last, when he judged he had enough cover from the thick trunks and low shrubs, he dared one more glance over his shoulder. Tanya stood in the clearing, her form partially obscured by leaves, but he could still sense her tension. She threw another suspicious look around, evidently debating whether to pursue the mysterious sound in the forest. Damien forced himself onward, letting the shadows swallow him as he fled in the opposite direction. His escape through the forest became a frantic dance of stifled footfalls and racing thoughts. His chest tightened from nerves and the exertion of weaving among the trees without betraying his presence. He struggled not to fixate on the horrifying reality that Tanya had allies from outside the fortress, other packs perhaps who hungered for a share of the territory. Every step hammered home the truth that if he did not reach Ezra swiftly, their entire home could be overrun by treachery. The forest around him, usually so tranquil at night, now felt sinister, as though every branch might snag him and hold him captive for Tanya's conspirators to find. He stumbled over a twisted root, catching himself before he fell. His mind churned with images of the fortress and all who lived there. Alara, with her uncertain lineage and shy determination. Lucas, his steady friend who had risked much to help them gather suspicious details. The loyal warriors who looked to Ezra for leadership. Damien clenched his jaw against the wave of dread. If Tanya succeeded, there would be no mercy for those who opposed her. The memory of her voice, speaking so coolly about removing anyone in her way, left a bitter taste in his mouth. Finally, the trees began to thin, and the fortress walls loomed in the distance. The sight of those tall ramparts, usually a symbol of security, now reminded him of how fragile their safety truly was. He knew he had to re-enter unseen to avoid drawing questions from any guards who might wonder about his late-night excursions. In the darkness, he spotted the narrow side gate that had been left unwatched after midnight. Slipping through the battered door, he stepped into a shadowy corridor. Adrenaline still pumped through his veins, and he nearly jumped when he heard footsteps echo. But fortune remained with him. The corridor's occupant was only a lone servant carrying a tray, too preoccupied to notice him melding with the gloom. Damien made his way swiftly through the fortress, navigating the labyrinthine halls with the practiced ease of one who had spent years patrolling these passages. Stopping by a torch-lit corner, he took a moment to compose himself, wiping cold sweat from his brow. He had to appear as calm as possible when facing Ezra, though his mind still reeled from the conspiracies he had overheard. The knowledge weighed on him like a chain around his neck. It was late, but light still burned in the Alpha's quarters. Damien suspected Ezra rarely slept soundly these days. A vigilant guard near the door stiffened upon recognizing Damien's approach. The Beta nodded briefly, but his urgent expression must have revealed the gravity of the situation, because the guard quickly stepped aside, allowing Damien to knock quietly. A muffled voice invited him to enter. Ezra stood in a small sitting area within his chambers, his posture rigid, arms folded across his broad chest. The lines of strain on his face indicated he had not anticipated visitors at this hour. When he recognized Damien, he blinked, puzzlement flickering in his eyes. "Damien," he said, voice low and controlled. "What brings you here so late?" Damien shut the door behind him, mindful of the guard outside. He crossed the room in a few steps. "I have news," he said, his breath coming in uneven gasps. "Urgent news that can't wait." Ezra's gaze sharpened at once, noticing Damien's disheveled state. "Tell me." It was more command than invitation. Damien did not waste a heartbeat. In an outpouring of hushed words, he recounted everything that had happened. Following Tanya into the woods, overhearing her secret meeting, the presence of cloaked outsiders who promised support and a plan to overthrow Ezra. He spared no detail, each recollection tangling with the next in his rush to convey the scale of betrayal. Ezra listened without interrupting, though a storm raged in his eyes. His jaw tightened visibly when Damien described Tanya's willingness to harm Alara if she posed a threat. That small mention cut deeper than anything else. And Ezra's voice, when he finally spoke, carried a tightly reined fury. "You're certain of what you heard?" Damien nodded, heart still pounding. "I am." She spoke plainly. She mentioned forging alliances beyond our borders, staging a rebellion from within, capitalizing on any sign of instability. She threatened Alara specifically. Ezra turned away, setting a hand against the mantel of a low-burning fireplace. The flames cast shadows that accentuated the tension in his face. "I see." He closed his eyes, taking a measured breath. "Damien, I always knew Tanya was ambitious, manipulative, but this..." His words trailed off. He turned to face Damien again, the flicker of the fire reflecting in his eyes. "Are you hurt?" It was a small question, but layered with a concern that made Damien swallow hard. "No, I managed to avoid them, but I was seconds away from being discovered." Ezra's gaze flicked to the door as though ensuring no eavesdroppers lingered. "No one can know about this, not yet." He gestured for Damien to come closer. His voice lowered, the words edged with controlled anger. "We need proof. If we confront Tanya openly now, she will deny everything, and if her allies within the fortress rally behind her, chaos will break out. We'll lose any chance of rooting out the entire plot." Damien exhaled shakily. "So you want us to keep this to ourselves? Meanwhile, she and whoever else is involved are plotting every minute." Ezra nodded, setting his jaw. "We have no choice. If we panic the pack, or if Tanya suspects we know, she might strike sooner, or vanish to bring her allies into the fortress by force." He paused, letting the thought settle. "We will stay vigilant. I'll call a meeting with you and Lucas soon. We'll gather every shred of evidence needed to prove her treachery beyond question. Then we'll crush this plot for good." Damien could sense the finality in Ezra's words, the cold fury that lurked beneath his calm composure. "I understand," he said quietly. "I only wish we had more time." Ezra's eyes narrowed, his fists clenching at his sides. "So do I. But we'll manage. We always have." He glanced away, the weight of betrayal flickering across his features. Then, in a softer tone, he asked, "You said she threatened Alara specifically. Did Tanya mention how close she is to acting on that?" Damien swallowed. "She spoke of removing Alara if she becomes too great a threat. I don't think she sees Alara as an immediate danger yet, but we can't take that risk lightly." Ezra's shoulders tensed as though absorbing a physical blow. "Number, we can't. I'll keep Alara safe no matter what." A moment of silence followed. Then he cleared his throat, his voice regaining its iron edge. "Thank you for bringing this to me, Damien. You've done well. Now get some rest. I need you steady for whatever comes next." Damien bowed, still rattled but relieved at having delivered his warning. He turned to go, but paused at the door. "Ezra," he said quietly, his tone laced with concern. "You know how dangerous Tanya can be. Don't underestimate her, or the resentment she might stoke among those who follow her." Ezra's jaw tightened. "I won't. Trust me, from this moment on I will not underestimate her again." With that final reassurance, Damien slipped out, leaving the Alpha alone to brood over the betrayal that threatened them all. Night pressed on, and Ezra did not sleep. Hours later, when the first traces of dawn lightened the sky, he still stood near the fireplace, wrestling with the tumult of rage, confusion, and hurt that threatened to boil over. It was a betrayal that cut more deeply than he had thought possible. Tanya had been by his side after his mate's death, helping him hold the fortress together when he nearly succumbed to despair. He had not imagined that her loyalty could be an elaborate facade for a cold, calculated plan to seize power. And now, learning she would set her sights on Alara, he exhaled sharply, his gaze dark with an anger that refused to fade. In the morning, the fortress began to stir as usual. Servants lit torches in the halls, and the clang of sparring warriors drifted through open windows. No outward sign revealed the cataclysmic shift that had occurred in Ezra's perception overnight. He too played his part, dressing for the day and appearing before his pack with practiced composure, as though nothing unusual gnawed at his thoughts. Deep inside, though, his mind churned with strategies, wondering how to best ensnare Tanya and all who conspired with her. Alara moved through the halls carrying a small basket of rolled bandages meant for the infirmary. Though her steps were purposeful, an undercurrent of unease lingered in her. The memory of Tanya's dark glares had not faded, nor had Alara forgotten the near-constant threats that seemed to linger in every gesture the other woman made. Yet as she passed several warriors heading out for patrol, she noticed that some of them nodded in greeting instead of ignoring her. A short while later, a servant paused to say a polite word about the supplies she was carrying, remarking that it was helpful to have an extra pair of hands. Small signs, but they hinted that Alara's quiet diligence was gradually earning respect or at least curiosity. Still, a tension stretched through the corridors, as though the fortress itself sensed an approaching storm. Alara's heightened awareness, sharpened by her bond with Asena, let her pick up whispered fragments of conversation about border troubles or rumors that certain elders disagreed with Ezra's leadership. She told herself to remain calm, trusting that Damien, Lucas, and Ezra had matters under control. She could only do her part, keeping her head down, her ears open, and her spirit ready. That was when Tanya found her again, in a courtyard where a handful of warriors trained under the late morning sun. Alara had just delivered the basket of bandages to one of the castle medics, hoping for a relatively peaceful day when Tanya's voice pierced the air. "There you are," Tanya said, stepping forward with her chin held high, her tone carrying an unmistakable note of scorn. Alara turned, meeting Tanya's gaze. She told herself to remain composed. Several of the warriors paused their drills, drawn by the tension emanating from Tanya's cold stare. Alara could feel the weight of their attention, pricking at her skin. She swallowed, recalling Asena's steady presence in her mind. "Be calm," the wolf seemed to murmur, even if that voice was more sensation than words. Tanya surveyed Alara from head to toe as though she were assessing a blemish in need of removal. "Surprising to see you still skulking around here," she began. "Though I suppose even the most useless things can find some menial task to pass the time." Alara's stomach twisted. She felt the urge to protest, but she forced herself to keep her composure, responding with a measured, "I do what I can." Tanya's eyes narrowed, her voice carrying louder so all in the courtyard could hear. "Do you, really? I suppose a girl who was sold off by her father for a fleeting peace arrangement isn't well versed in dignity. But I'd at least expect gratitude for the generosity extended to you here. Instead, you lurk, always eager to draw attention from those who should be focused on real concerns." A hush fell over the courtyard, a few onlookers shifting awkwardly. Alara felt her cheeks burn at the harshness of Tanya's words, but she lifted her gaze. "I'm not seeking attention. I'm only doing my part." Tanya's laugh was a short, sharp bark. "Your part?" The half-wolf outcast scurrying around on errands as if that somehow makes you special. She took a step closer, her stance predatory. "Let's be honest. If not for your mother's rumored magic, you'd be nothing more than a stray dog in this fortress." Alara's heart pounded, but she refused to look away. The sting of Tanya's insults cut deeply, reminding her of her father's cruelty. For an instant, she considered a retort, but no words formed that would not inflame the confrontation further. She simply locked eyes with Tanya, channeling every drop of determination she had. Tanya sneered. "Nothing to say? Or perhaps you've learned that your trivial existence here is already skating on thin ice." She cast a glance around at the warriors who observed, some looking uncomfortable, others uncertain whether to intervene. "Look at her," Tanya called out loudly. "Is this the one you'd place your faith in? A girl who can barely speak for herself, who knows nothing of genuine leadership or the trials of the pack?" Alara's hands curled at her sides. Anger flared, but Asena's calming presence reminded her to maintain control. She could feel the eyes of the courtyard on her, some sympathetic, some simply curious. She drew a steady breath, not wanting to stoop to Tanya's level. "I've never asked for your faith," she said at last. "I only want to live here without fear." Tanya's lips pulled back in a contemptuous smile. "Then you'd best learn to keep your head down, because it's a very thin line between tolerated stray and worthless hindrance." She moved as though to step even closer, but before she could continue, the courtyard's onlookers suddenly shifted their attention. A stirring of unease rippled among the warriors, and Alara realized that Alpha Ezra had appeared at the edge of the square. Ezra's presence fell over them like a sudden hush. Tanya turned, catching sight of him, and Alara saw a flicker of something in Tanya's eyes, surprise perhaps. The watchers parted instinctively, making way for their alpha. He strode forward, each step steady, his expression carved from stone. His gaze moved from Tanya to Alara, and the cold anger simmering in his eyes made Alara's heart pound for reasons that had nothing to do with fear. "Tanya," Ezra said in a low, commanding voice, "Well, what is the meaning of this?" Tanya drew herself up, trying to recover her composure. "Alpha," she said, dipping her head. "I was merely reminding Alara of her place. She has grown bold, and I thought it best to correct her behavior before it leads to discord." A murmur spread through the onlookers. Alara clenched her jaw, uncertain how Ezra would respond. She expected him to keep a measure of neutrality, but what happened next took her by complete surprise. Ezra's eyes hardened and his voice rose enough for everyone present to hear. "Your behavior, Tanya, is what leads to discord. I will not tolerate public humiliation of any pack member." He leveled her with a look so fierce that even Tanya's usual confidence seemed to falter. Tanya's composure cracked for a second, then she forced a brittle smile. "Alpha, surely you don't believe—" He silenced her with a raised hand. The courtyard fell into a hush so profound that Alara could hear her own breath. "I have witnessed enough," Ezra said sharply. "You would humiliate someone beneath our protection in front of the entire fortress? Is that the standard of leadership you wish to set?" Tanya's face reddened, her frustration clearly building behind the mask she wore. "I only meant to ensure discipline." "Discipline?" Ezra cut in, eyes blazing. "There's a difference between discipline and cruelty. You will not address Alara or any member of this pack in that manner again. Do you understand?" Alara watched, stunned, as Tanya's fury flashed briefly in her hazel eyes. Still, she bowed her head, likely realizing the precariousness of the situation. "Yes, Alpha." But Ezra was not finished. In a voice dripping with controlled anger, he announced, "Effective immediately. Your authority in organizing pack duties is revoked. I will arrange for someone else to handle those responsibilities. You may focus on your own tasks and consider this your warning." Murmurs swept through the courtyard. Warriors exchanged glances, and Alara could practically feel their collective astonishment. For years, Tanya had held significant sway under Ezra's rule, stepping in after his mate's death. This public demotion was more than a reprimand, it was a shift in the pack's balance of power. Tanya's hands curled at her sides, the humiliation evident on her face. She opened her mouth, then closed it, plainly struggling to retain her composure in front of so many. At last, she hissed, "As you wish," and spun on her heel, stalking away without another word. The watchers parted to let her pass, and some dared not even look in her direction, fearing the wrath that simmered beneath her forced calm. Alara stood stunned, the pounding of her heart echoing in her ears. She noticed a half-dozen gazes flick in her direction, some with sympathy, others with newfound respect. Slowly, the courtyard's usual rhythms resumed. Warriors returning to drills, servants continuing with their tasks, though the air remained charged with the sense that a line had been crossed. Something fundamental in the fortress's dynamics changed. Alara tried to steady her breathing, grateful beyond words that Ezra had intervened. Ezra himself lingered, as though ensuring that Tanya would not return to retaliate. His eyes met Alara's, and for a fleeting moment, something softer passed between them, an unspoken acknowledgement that he had taken a stand for her. Then he turned and strode away, giving a curt nod to dismiss the onlookers back to their routines. Alara was left to gather her tumultuous thoughts in the aftermath. In the hours that followed, subtle changes rippled through the fortress. More than once, Alara caught the eye of a pack warrior who offered her a polite greeting. A servant handing out midday meals in one of the lower halls paused to give Alara a friendly nod. She could sense quiet discussions in corners, people remarking on Tanya's scolding from the Alpha. Though Alara could not make out every detail of their whispers, she felt the shift in loyalties, a small pivot away from Tanya's once unquestioned authority. At the same time, Alara could not help but remain vigilant, well aware that Tanya's wrath would only intensify, especially after such a public blow to her pride. Later that day, while taking a moment to rest her feet in a more secluded corridor, Alara found her thoughts drifting to the possibility that Tanya was not only personally venomous, but also cunning in more dangerous ways. Damien and Lucas had shared glimpses of their suspicions. Asena, in the recesses of Alara's mind, urged her to remain strong. Alara let out a measured breath and realized that, in the near future, she might be forced to stand against Tanya in ways more direct than verbal sparring. She did not have long to ponder. A guard approached, indicating that Ezra wanted to see her in a small reading alcove near his personal chambers. Alara's pulse quickened. She made her way there, finding the alcove lit by a single lantern. Ezra stood by a heavy wooden table, flipping absently through pages of a patrol ledger as though his mind were elsewhere. He looked up when she arrived, and she noted the tension in his stance, the faint lines of strain around his eyes that had grown more pronounced since she first came to the fortress. "Alara," he said, his tone gentler than she was used to. "Come in, please." She stepped into the alcove, and he gestured for her to take a seat on a carved wooden chair opposite him. The intimacy of the setting, so different from the watchful eyes of the courtyard, set her nerves fluttering. "Thank you," she said quietly, settling into the chair. You didn't have to step in earlier on my behalf. Tanya might hold that against you." Ezra's eyes flickered. "She already holds enough against me, I suspect. But you're not to blame for her outburst. She crossed a line, and it was time it was addressed." Alara swallowed. "Still, I appreciate it. Most of my life, I've faced cruelty without anyone stopping it." She lowered her gaze, recalling the years under her father's volatile temper. He set the ledger aside, leaning on the table. "I won't deny that once, I thought Tanya's methods, her bluntness, were beneficial, a means to keep order when I was, in mourning." His voice tightened at the memory. "But this cruelty is a different beast. If I'd known how far she would go, I would have stopped it sooner." Alara glanced at him, drawn by the undercurrent of pain she heard. She thought of how Damien had said Tanya had once been close to Ezra, stepping in after the loss of his mate. A flicker of sympathy stirred in her chest, even as she battled confusion over how to feel about the man who had accepted her here, but kept her at arm's length. "I'm sorry," she said softly, "for what you've gone through, and for the burdens you still carry." Ezra released a slow breath, his amber eyes flicking to hers. "There is, much on my mind these days. More than you know, but it's not your place to worry about that. I summoned you because I wanted to see how you were faring after this morning's scene." Her pulse quickened at his direct concern. "I'm all right," Tanya's words stung, "but I'm learning to endure. I can't let her see me bow." He gave a small, approving nod. "You show more resilience than many realize. Even so, be cautious. She was humiliated in front of the pack, and her pride will demand retribution." Alara felt a shiver at his warning, but she nodded. "I'll be careful." A hesitation lingered before she dared to add, "I've also been discovering more about my mother's bloodline, my wolf. I feel Asena's presence more strongly each day. I can't ignore that anymore." Ezra's posture shifted, a new interest lighting his gaze. "Your wolf speaks to you?" "In a way," Alara said, unsure how to describe it. "It's more like a comforting awareness, a guiding sense that I'm not alone. It's grown stronger since I came here, as though leaving my father's hold allowed it to awaken." Ezra's expression gentled. "I see. Do you fear it?" Alara considered the question. "I don't fear the wolf itself, but I fear what Tanya or others might do if they learn the true extent of my abilities. There are rumors that my mother's lineage carried a special kind of magic. I'm not sure I'm ready to confront that publicly." Ezra studied her, and for a moment, the quiet in the alcove thickened with emotion. "Your mother's gifts may be a blessing for this pack, if we stand together. From what I've seen of you, you don't strike me as someone who would misuse power. But we can't ignore the danger you mentioned. There are those who might see you as a threat." She could feel an odd warmth spread through her chest at his words, an acknowledgement of her potential rather than dismissal. "I only want to protect what's important," she whispered, her mind drifting to the fortress, to those who had shown her kindness and to the uncertain pull she felt toward Ezra himself. He inclined his head, tension easing from his shoulders. "So do I. And that includes protecting you." His voice caught slightly, as though he had surprised himself with his own admission. Alara's cheeks heated, and a silence lapsed between them, heavy with unspoken confessions. Before either could delve further, footsteps sounded in the corridor. Ezra cleared his throat, regaining his composure. "We should talk again soon. And if Tanya or anyone else threatens you again, come to me immediately." Alara rose from her seat, her heart beating at a pace that made her feel breathless. "Thank you, Alpha." She hesitated, meeting his gaze one last time. I appreciate your concern." With that, she slipped out, leaving Ezra alone with his thoughts. She sensed that something profound had shifted in the space between them. Yet now was not the time to dwell on unspoken feelings. Danger stalked the fortress, and they all had a role to play if they were to avert disaster. Not long after, Ezra convened a discreet meeting with Damien and Lucas in a small, dim room near the armory. The stone walls absorbed their hushed voices, ensuring no curious ears overheard. Damien looked weary, shadows under his eyes from the night's ordeal, while Lucas listened intently, arms folded across his chest. Ezra spoke in a controlled, level tone, though anger sparked beneath his words. "We'll keep a close watch on Tanya and Elder Cyrus. We must confirm everyone in league with them. We can't topple a conspiracy without understanding its full extent." Damien nodded. "They're cunning, especially Tanya. We need to be sure we catch every accomplice. If we only expose part of the plot, the rest will scatter and return stronger." Lucas added quietly, "I've been noting which pack members gravitate toward Tanya, either out of fear or loyalty. There aren't many, but enough that we can't be certain who to trust." Ezra tapped a finger against the table. "Stay vigilant. We'll act once we have hard evidence that Tanya cannot refute and Cyrus cannot defend. Until then, we continue as though nothing has changed. Understood?" Both men affirmed their understanding. Damien added, "And Alara? She's at risk if Tanya senses she could be a rallying point for your leadership. We can't let her wander unprotected." A flicker of worry crossed Ezra's face. "I agree. Keep an eye on her. I'll do the same, but quietly. If we're too obvious, Tanya will see we've guessed her intentions." They parted soon after, each carrying the weight of the secret that could topple the fortress if revealed prematurely. Ezra, left alone, stared at the table, fists clenched with simmering rage. Yet beneath that rage lay a more personal turmoil, an unexpected sense of protectiveness toward Alara that he could not fully explain. Something about her quiet bravery, her resilience, had awakened feelings he had long kept buried. Late that night, Ezra returned to his private quarters. The chamber felt too large, the silence too thick. He sank into a chair near a crackling fireplace, letting his mind replay the day's events. Tanya's open humiliation, the shock on her face when he publicly stripped her of authority, gave him a grim sense of satisfaction. Yet he also felt a pang of grief recalling the friend Tanya had once seemed to be. That memory battled with the knowledge of her current treachery, the severity of her betrayal, impossible to forgive. His thoughts lingered on Alara, the way she had stood in the courtyard with her head held high even as Tanya aimed to tear her down. He remembered the flicker of hurt in her eyes, the restraint in her voice, and the gentle determination that seemed to define her. A fierce vow stirred within him to ensure Tanya never harmed Alara, or used her as a pawn in this twisted conspiracy. But more than mere duty kindled inside him. He could not deny the quiet attraction he felt toward Alara, her kindness and courage sparking warmth in the cold places left by his grief. Leaning his head back, he closed his eyes. The fortress was quiet now, most of its inhabitants asleep, but a subtle pulse of tension still reverberated in the stone walls, a foreboding that everything might soon unravel. Between the threat of outside allies conspiring with Tanya and the knowledge that some elders might side with her if a power grab began, Ezra knew the storm was coming. Only a careful, strategic strike would expose the traitors without igniting a civil war. A swirl of fatigue and determination washed over him. He pictured Alara once more, her hesitant smile, the sincerity in her gaze when she spoke of her mother's magic. She was more than a symbol of rumored power. She was a living soul who had suffered and fought to find her place. That reality strengthened his resolve. Whatever tangled emotions bound them, he refused to let Tanya's schemes consume Alara. The fortress might be on the brink of crisis, but he would stand between Alara and any threat, no matter the cost. The fire crackled softly, its glow casting shifting shadows along the walls. Ezra listened to its gentle crackle, remembering his mate's death and all the emptiness that followed. His heart twisted in an uneasy mixture of grief and longing. How had it come to this moment where he found himself drawing closer to a woman who had been forced into his pack as part of a cruel arrangement? Yet the truth was undeniable. Alara had awakened something in him that he had believed lost forever, and now, as treachery closed in on every side, that fragile new spark gave him the strength he needed to fight for his people, for his pack, and for the woman whose quiet courage lit a path through the gathering darkness. His mind flickered over the plan he had outlined to Damien and Lucas. They would watch, gather more evidence, and tighten the net around Tanya and her accomplices. He reminded himself that patience was crucial. A wrong move could unleash bloodshed in the fortress, but the moment he had that final, irrefutable proof, he would deliver judgment. No more half measures, no more uncertain loyalties. Tanya had to be stopped. Ezra sat there for a long while, letting the flames die down to embers. In that silent space, he forged his resolution into something sharp and unwavering. He would guard Alara, even from the knowledge that her life was in immediate peril, if it spared her fear while they prepared to root out the conspiracy. He would not fail as an alpha, nor fail the one who had come to represent a final hope for both healing and renewal in his wounded heart. At last the embers began to fade. The hour was late and his body demanded rest, though his mind still buzzed with unresolved thoughts. Rising from the chair, he ran a weary hand through his hair and let out a slow breath. The fortress slept, but he knew a shadow lurked in its halls, wearing the face of someone he had once trusted. Tomorrow, he would guide the pack as usual, keep up appearances, and set the stage for the confrontation to come. Day by day, step by step, he would tighten his hold on the fortress, ensuring Tanya had nowhere to run when the moment of reckoning arrived. The last wisp of warmth from the fire brushed against him as he left the fireplace behind. His footsteps carried him across the dim chamber to the bed he had barely slept in for months. His heart felt heavy, weighed down by betrayal, but within that heaviness gleamed a fierce spark of purpose. He would see justice done, protect Alara, and preserve the pack from the ravages of a civil war. Tomorrow, the fortress would awaken again, oblivious to the storm brewing beneath its orderly surface. But soon, that storm would break and the traitors would discover that Alpha Ezra was not so easily toppled. He closed his eyes, the memory of Alara's earnest gaze lingering behind his eyelids. For the first time in a long while, he allowed himself the faintest stirrings of hope. Betrayal or not, darkness or not, he would fight for the future he wanted to build, a future safe for Alara, for his pack, and for the lingering memory of the mate he had lost. And if that meant tearing out the very roots of conspiracy in his own fortress, he would do so without hesitation, no matter the cost. With that final, uncompromising vow, he let exhaustion claim him, the whisper of the night wind outside the only witness to the tumult in his soul.